By 1980, Moscow had built 40,000 identical apartment buildings. They were supposed to last 100 years. Most started cracking within 10. Some collapsed while families were still living inside. It is the summer of 1980. The air is thick with humidity and the smell of wet asphalt. You are standing on a hill on the edge of the city, looking out toward the horizon. But there is no horizon. There is only a vast gray ocean of reinforced concrete stretching as far as the eye can see. This is the Soviet Union as it actually exists, not the version being broadcast to the world on color television. Down in the historic center, just a few miles away, the 22nd Olympiad is beginning. The streets have been scrubbed clean. The homeless and the dissidents have been quietly removed, shipped off beyond the 101st kilometer so they don't spoil the view for foreign cameras. Shop shelves that are usually empty are suddenly stocked with Finnish salami and Pepsi Cola. It is a meticulously curated facade, a superpower of order and abundance. But here, in the sleeping districts of Belyevo and Chernobyl, the reality is different. This is where the people live, and the reality here is crumbling. You walk up to one of the massive towers. It's a Brezhnevka, 16 stories of prefabricated paneling rising like a tombstone against the pale sky. The state propaganda machine calls this an engineering marvel. They told the first residents that these walls would stand for a century. But look closer. There are hairline fractures running up the side of the building, tracing the lines where the massive concrete panels meet. You put your hand against the wall. It's summer, but the concrete feels cold, clammy. Somewhere inside, deep in the structure, something is groaning. These buildings are not just settling, they are actively decaying. The reality embedded in these walls tells a story the party desperately wants to hide. Detailed retrospective analysis shows that by 1980, the Soviet housing stock was already in a state of accelerated decay. Most of these mass-produced towers began exhibiting significant structural defects, cracking, leaking, and shifting within 10 years of their completion. Think about that. A home built to last a lifetime begins to fail before a child born inside it finishes elementary school. Some buildings displayed signs of catastrophic failure before the first residents had even unpacked their boxes.
The juxtaposition is jarring. While the world watches gymnasts and sprinters in the gleaming Olympic stadiums, millions of Muscovites are engaged in a quiet daily struggle against their own homes. These are buildings that leak when it rains, groan in the wind, and, in terrified whispers, are rumored to collapse. The sheer scale of this construction is staggering. To achieve the housing targets of the late Soviet period, the construction complex consumed raw materials at an industrial rate. For a typical district development, they utilized approximately 15,000 tons of metal and 40,000 tons of cement. It was an operation of biblical proportions. Yet, despite these massive inputs, the output was chemically compromised and structurally unsound. This is the mystery of 1980s Moscow. It is not merely a mystery of aesthetic monotony, though the buildings are soul-crushingly identical, but of a profound systemic failure. How did a superpower capable of launching space stations and building nuclear submarines construct a capital city that was effectively rotting from the inside out? To understand this, you have to go back. You have to understand the mentality that created this concrete jungle. The answer lies in a convergence of political pressure, economic corruption, and a labor system that prioritized speed over human survival. It starts with a decision made 25 years earlier. The year is 1955. Nikita Khrushchev issues a decree with a boring name but devastating consequences on the elimination of excesses in design and construction. Overnight, architecture is outlawed. It is no longer an art, it is an industrial process. The goal is simple: transform the construction site into an assembly line. The house is no longer a unique structure designed for a specific location, it is a machine for living, composed of standardized parts manufactured in factories and assembled on site. Enter the K7 series.
Designed by engineer Vitaly Lagutenko, the K7 is the grandfather of the Soviet concrete landscape. It is a triumph of speed over comfort. It utilizes a frameless panel design where the internal walls act as the load-bearing structure. This allows the exterior walls to be shockingly thin. How thin? In some places, just a few centimeters of concrete separate you from the Russian winter. The statistics of the K7 production are the stuff of nightmares for a structural engineer. A standard 5-story K7 building could be assembled in just 12 days. 12 days to build a home for 100 families. Propaganda films of the era boasted of assembly times as short as 5 days. Between 1961 and 1968, they built 64,000 units of this type in Moscow alone. That is 3 million square meters of housing erected in the blink of an historical eye. But there was a catch. There is always a catch. Officially, these buildings were intended to last just 25 years. They were a temporary measure, a stopgap until the transition to full communism was complete and everyone could move into a palace. But by 1980, the K7s had nearly reached the end of their theoretical lifespan. Did the state replace them? No. They remained the primary housing for millions. The temporary nature of the housing became permanent. The deterioration accelerated. The concrete began to carbonate, the steel began to rust, and the people stayed, trapped in buildings that were expiring around them. As the Khrushchev era gave way to the stagnation of Brezhnev, the buildings grew taller. The 5-story walk-ups evolved into 9, 12, and 16-story towers. These new Brezhnevkas had elevators and garbage chutes, amenities the earlier models lacked. But they retained the fundamental flaw of the panel system, the prioritization of gross output over structural integrity. The pressure to build was immense. By the late Soviet period, estimates suggested a need for an additional 40 million housing units to meet the population's needs. This insatiable demand drove the construction ministries to push for taller buildings and faster assembly methods, often at the expense of safety protocols. And this is where the story gets darker, because it wasn't just about bad design, it was about what was actually going into the walls. In the harsh Moscow climate, where temperatures regularly dropped below -25 degrees Celsius, the connections between these massive panels became critical failure points. These joints, where the panels were bolted together, were notorious thermal bridges. The metal weld points were uninsulated. They acted as conductors, drawing heat out of the apartments and allowing the cold to penetrate deep into the structure. Residents famously reported walls that were cold to the touch, not just cool, freezing. Walls covered in condensation or frost on the interior. To combat this, families hung heavy wool carpets on the walls. You see these in old photos and think it's a decoration, a cultural quirk. It wasn't. It was a survival mechanism, a necessary layer of supplemental insulation against the radiating cold of the concrete. But the cold was just the beginning. The buildings were chemically unstable. The longevity of reinforced concrete depends on the alkalinity of the cement paste. This protects the steel rebar from rust. But in 1980s Moscow, a chemical process called carbonation was eating these buildings alive. Atmospheric carbon dioxide reacts with the concrete, lowering its pH. Once it drops below a critical threshold, the steel becomes vulnerable. This process should take decades. In Moscow, it was happening in years. Why? Because of the lean concrete epidemic. Due to theft and supply chain mismanagement, the concrete mix often contained insufficient cement and an excess of water or aggregate. It was watered down. This created a porous material that allowed CO2 and moisture to penetrate rapidly, reaching the steel reinforcement much faster than predicted. The metal skeletons of these buildings began to rust and dissolve within a decade. This led to the cracking phenomenon observed by residents. The buildings were literally dissolving from the inside out. But there is something even more disturbing than the rest. Something that renovation crews and demolition teams are only now discovering as they tear these buildings apart.
They are finding things inside the walls. Not structural components, not insulation. They are uncovering bizarre debris embedded in the concrete panels. Construction uniforms, empty vodka bottles, and organic waste. This wasn't an accident. This was a consequence of the on-site conditions. Workers, lacking proper waste disposal facilities and motivated by apathy or malice, would dispose of trash into the hollow forms before the concrete was poured. They would throw their lunch scraps, their old clothes, their garbage into the voids between the panels. This created biological time bombs. Organic matter would decompose over the years, releasing gases and foul odors directly into the apartments. Residents would complain of a persistent, sickly sweet smell of rot that no amount of cleaning could remove. They would scrub the floors with bleach, repaint the ceilings, and boil vinegar on the stove, unaware that the source of the stench was a decaying chicken carcass or a bag of food waste sealed into the load-bearing wall of their living room. This is the olfactory landscape of the Soviet sleeping district. It wasn't just the smell of rot, it was a complex bouquet of stagnation. Walk into the stairwell of a typical Brezhnevka in 1980. The first thing that hits you is the smell of the garbage chute. This was supposed to be a modern convenience, a symbol of progress that meant you didn't have to walk your trash outside. In reality, it was a curse. The vertical chutes were often clogged or poorly cleaned. In the stifling heat of a Moscow summer, the waste piled in the basement bins would ferment. The gases would rise up the chute like a chimney, venting the scent of rotting cabbage and refuse into every stairwell on every floor. Combine this with the damp. Because of the leaking roofs and the porous panel joints we talked about, dampness was chronic. The smell of wet concrete and mold permeated the hallways. It was the scent of a building that was sweating, unable to breathe. But the sensory assault wasn't just about smell, it was about sound. If you stood in your living room in District 7, you were effectively living with your neighbors. The acoustic privacy in these panel buildings was non-existent. The heavy concrete reflected sound, and the shockingly thin partition walls transmitted it perfectly. A family argument on the third floor could be followed in detail by residents on the fourth and second floors. This lack of privacy created a high-stress environment where domestic life was inadvertently communal. You knew when your neighbor was eating, when they were watching television, and when they were fighting. The separate apartment, the great promise of the communist state, was an illusion. You were alone, but you were never silent. To understand why these buildings were built with such disregard for human experience, you have to look at who was building them. While the Soviet Union produced world-class theoretical engineers capable of designing rockets, the actual execution on the ground was left to a workforce that was often unskilled or semi-skilled. The men and women pouring the concrete and welding the joints were not master craftsmen. They were the limitchiki. This term is crucial to understanding the collapse of Soviet housing. It comes from the limit, or quota, of residence permits issued to enterprises. These were migrant workers recruited from the desperate poverty of the provinces to perform the arduous labor that native Muscovites refused to do. The limitchiki existed in a state of precarious semi-legality. They were granted temporary residence rights in Moscow, but these rights were tied strictly to their employment. They lived in dormitories or barracks on the outskirts of the construction sites, often in squalid conditions marked by overcrowding and poor sanitation. Imagine the psychology of this construction site. You are a young man from a rural village. You are living in a dirty barrack. You are building a skyscraper for a privileged Muscovite family. You have no connection to this building. You will never live here. Your only goal is the propiska, the coveted permanent residency permit. The pathway to that permit is 5 to 10 years of continuous hard labor. And here is the fatal flaw in the system. You are paid piece rate wages based on volume. You are paid for the number of bricks laid, the number of panels installed, the number of welds completed.
Speed is the only metric that matters for your income and your eventual liberation from the dormitories. Quality? Quality is irrelevant. If you take the time to properly insulate a joint or ensure a wall is perfectly plumb, you are losing money. You are delaying your own freedom. This alienation fostered a culture of negligence. The workers were building homes for others, the people who looked down on them, while they themselves lived in mud and filth. So if a vodka bottle falls into the concrete form, leave it. If the welding isn't perfect, cover it up. This disconnect between the sophisticated design tolerances of the prefabricated panels and the rough, rapid assembly by the workforce was catastrophic. The panels were designed by engineers with PhDs, but they were installed by farm boys who had learned to weld a week ago. The result was the misalignment of walls, gaps in joints, and the structural eccentricities that plagued the residents. Sometimes the architects tried to break the monotony. They tried to innovate, and the results were even worse. In the 1970s, in a desperate attempt to make the skyline look futuristic, they built the roundhouses in Moscow. These were massive, ring-shaped structures, 155 meters in diameter. They were intended to be self-contained communities with shops and services on the ground floor. It looked incredible on paper. It looked like a spaceship had landed in the suburbs, but on a human level, it was a failure. The acoustics of the enclosed courtyard created a whispering gallery effect. If a child shouted on the playground in the center, the sound was amplified and blasted into every single apartment in the ring. There was no escape from the noise. The wind aerodynamics were miscalculated. The circular shape caused drafts to swirl continuously inside the courtyard, creating a permanent howling vortex. Inside the apartments, the walls were trapezoidal. Standard Soviet furniture, which was rectangular and mass-produced, couldn't fit against the curved walls. These buildings stand today as monuments to the disconnect between the grand architectural vision and the nuances of daily life. But while the architects were making mistakes in geometry, a much darker game was being played with the materials themselves. We mentioned earlier that the concrete was lean, that it lacked cement. This wasn't just an engineering error. It wasn't just a mistake at the factory. It was a crime scene. By 1980, the Soviet second economy, the black market, had thoroughly penetrated the construction sector. The rigid central planning system, with its unrealistic quotas and chronic shortages, created an environment where theft and corruption were not just crimes, but survival strategies. Theft of building materials was endemic. It was an open secret. Imagine a truck driver. He is tasked with transporting high-grade cement to a site where a 16-story apartment block is being built for 500 families. He stops halfway. He meets a black market buyer, perhaps someone building a private dacha for a party official. He sells half the load of cement for cash. Now he has a problem. The truck is light. The volume is missing. If he arrives at the site with half a load, he'll be caught. So what does he do? He drives to a riverbank, he grabs a shovel, and he replaces the missing volume with whatever is at hand, sand, dirt, or silt. He mixes it into the remaining cement. When he arrives at the construction site, the foreman checks the volume. The truck is full. He signs the paper. The cement is poured into the foundation of a high-rise tower. This adulteration had catastrophic consequences for the concrete's strength. The lean concrete mentioned in engineering reports wasn't just a bad recipe, it was the result of deliberate dilution. The buildings of the 1980s were chemically distinct from their design specifications. They contained a patchwork of high-quality and compromised materials distributed randomly throughout the structure. One floor might be solid. The next floor might be held together by sand and luck. You might be asking, how did nobody notice? How did the inspectors not see that the concrete was the wrong color, or that the walls were crooked, or that the heating systems weren't connected? The answer is the most dangerous word in the Soviet industrial vocabulary: Tufta. Tufta.
It is a word that doesn't translate easily, but it defines the entire late Soviet experience. Roughly, it means falsification of reports or window dressing, but in the context of the construction industry, it meant survival through lying. Here is how the system actually worked. Every layer of the Soviet bureaucracy was under immense, crushing pressure to meet the plan. The plan was the sacred text of the economy. It dictated everything. The worker needs to meet his daily quota of bricks laid to get his bonus. The foreman needs the team to meet the collective quota to avoid penalties. The ministry needs to report to the Central Committee that the housing targets for the 5-year plan were met. So, what happens when you run out of glass for the windows, or when the heating pipes haven't arrived? You lie. If a building was finished structurally but had no window glass, or if the elevators weren't wired, it was often signed off as complete anyway. The foreman would sign the paper, the ministry would stamp it, the statistics would go up, another 500 families housed. The residents would be moved in, and the defects would be listed on a separate sheet as rectifications, minor issues to be fixed later. But later never came. This culture of performative compliance meant that the official statistics, 40,000 buildings, millions of square meters, masked a reality of hollow achievements. Families were moving into apartments that were effectively shells. There are stories from the 1980s of residents moving into high-rises in midwinter, only to find the radiators were cold metal decorations bolted to the wall, connected to absolutely nothing. They slept in fur coats and boiled water on gas stoves to keep the air temperature above freezing, while the official paperwork in the Kremlin stated their district was fully modernized. As the economic stagnation of the 1980s deepened, the falsification became endemic. The pressure to maintain the illusion of growth led to a direct increase in Tufta. The buildings constructed just before the collapse are the most dangerous of all. They are the physical embodiment of a lie. But here is the turning point. Here is the detail that transforms this from a story about incompetence into a story about betrayal. You might think, well, the Soviet Union was struggling, resources were scarce, maybe this was the best they could do. You would be wrong, because while the masses were contending with the lean concrete and the biological bombs in the sleeping districts, a parallel world existed, a world where the laws of physics and economics seemed to operate differently. It was called Tsarskoye Selo, the Tsar's village, but there were no czars here, only the leaders of the Communist Party. Let's take a trip to 26 Kutuzovsky Prospect.
From the outside, it looks imposing but not radically different from other buildings. But inside, it is a different universe. This was the home of Leonid Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov, and Mikhail Suslov. While your apartment in Chernobyl has a ceiling height of 2.5 meters, just enough to not feel like a coffin, the ceilings here soar to 3.5 meters. While your walls are made of 30-centimeter thick hollow concrete panels that leak heat like a sieve, the walls here are solid brick masonry over 70 centimeters thick. Brick is expensive, it is labor-intensive, it is slow, but it is warm and it lasts forever. But the most shocking difference wasn't the materials, it was the hands that built it. We talked about the limachiki, the unskilled migrants desperate for a residence permit, rushing to meet quotas, throwing trash into the walls. They were not allowed near Kutovskoy Prospect. The elite housing was constructed by the KGB Construction Corps. These were vetted specialists. They were not paid by the piece. They were not rushing. They were subject to individual inspection of their work. If a brick was laid crooked, it was removed and laid again. This disparity reveals a terrifying truth. The structural defects of the mass housing were not inevitable consequences of Soviet technology. They were deliberate choices in resource allocation. The state possessed the capability to build high-quality, durable, and comfortable housing. They had the bricks, they had the skilled labor, they had the engineering know-how. They simply chose to reserve that capacity for a tiny fraction of the population.
The inequality extended beyond the walls. The elite districts were serviced by a separate infrastructure that was invisible to the common citizen. In 1980, a resident of a sleeping district might queue for 3 hours to buy soup bones with barely any meat on them. Meanwhile, the nomenklatura, the party elite, had access to special distributors. These were unmarked stores with frosted windows or home delivery services that brought goods directly to the spacious service entrances of Kutuzovsky Prospect. They ate Finnish salami, they drank Pepsi-Cola, they had air conditioning, they got concierges. This invisible divide created a deep, corroding cynicism among the population. The equality preached by the ideology was visibly contradicted by the skyline itself. Every morning, the workers from the crumbling concrete periphery would crowd onto the metro to travel to the center to work, passing the brick fortresses of their leaders. They saw the difference. They felt the cold in their own walls, and they saw the warm glow from the windows of the elite. But the elite made a miscalculation. They thought that as long as they were comfortable, the system would hold. They didn't realize that by building the mass housing on the foundation of lies and lean concrete, they were creating a physical liability that would outlast their own regime. The Brezhnevkas were becoming dangerous. We mentioned earlier that some buildings collapsed. This wasn't hyperbole. In the late Soviet period, the rectifications list grew so long that it became unmanageable. The steel connections inside the panels were rusting faster than anyone predicted. 100-year guarantee was quietly forgotten. Then came the incidents that were hushed up. A balcony falling off in a gentle breeze, a staircase separating from the wall. These were local tragedies, kept out of the papers by the censors, but the physics of corrosion doesn't care about censorship. The systemic failure led to a terrifying reality for the average Muscovite. You were living inside a machine that was slowly breaking down, and the operator had abandoned the controls. The turning point comes when you realize that the danger wasn't just that the buildings were ugly or cold, it was that they were structurally redundant. A single failure point could lead to a progressive collapse. And the biggest shock? The engineers knew. Reports from the era, buried in the archives, show that the construction ministries were aware of the thermal bridge issues. They were aware of the carbonation rates. They knew about the Tufta. But to speak up was to question the plan. To question the plan was to question the party. And in 1980, with the Olympics in town and the world watching, nobody was going to question the party. So they kept building. They poured 40,000 tons of cement into a district, diluted it with dirt, signed the papers, and moved 100,000 people into potential tombs. By 1985, the facade was not just cracking, it was peeling away to reveal a surreal, chaotic mechanism underneath. The unraveling of the Soviet housing dream wasn't instantaneous. It was a slow, grinding realization that life in the future required you to become a petty criminal just to survive the present. Welcome to the second economy of the apartment block. The state promised you a modern apartment with heating, electricity, and sanitation. The state lied. But the Soviet citizen was resourceful. If the state provided a shell, the citizen would build the life inside, usually through bribery and theft. Let's go back to that leaking pipe in your kitchen in Belyevo. The water is dripping, ruining the linoleum that is already peeling because it was glued down with expired adhesive. You call the ZHEC, the local housing maintenance committee. They tell you you are on a waiting list. Maybe in 3 weeks, the dispatcher says, bored. You don't wait 3 weeks. You go to the store. You don't buy pipes, you can't find them. You buy a bottle of vodka, the liquid currency. You find the local plumber, usually a man named Sasha or Ivan who officially works for the ZHEC but is currently unavailable. You show him the bottle. Suddenly, he is available. He produces a gasket from his pocket, a gasket that was likely stolen from the state inventory that morning. He fixes the leak. You drink the vodka together. This was the shadow tax of living in the concrete jungle. The infrastructure was so poorly executed that an entire black market of maintenance emerged to keep the buildings habitable. Elevator mechanics, electricians, glaziers, they all operated on a system of tips and bribes. The state owned the building, but the vodka owned the repairs. But no amount of vodka could fix the psychological toll of the hive. We talked about the acoustics, but we didn't talk about the madness. The heavy concrete panels were excellent at reflecting sound, and the gaps between them acted as acoustic highways. It is midnight. You are trying to sleep. Above you, a neighbor is walking across the floor. It sounds like a hammer striking an anvil. To your left, a couple is arguing. You can hear every word. To your right, a television is playing a patriotic war movie. This lack of acoustic privacy contributed to a specific form of urban neurosis. You were never truly alone. The separate apartment was a lie. You were living in a panopticon of sound. Domestic disputes became public performances. The intimacy of family life was stripped away. And then there was the panel depression. This wasn't an official medical diagnosis, but it was a very real physiological response to the environment. The sensory landscape of the sleeping districts was a relentless assault of gray. The endless repetition of identical 16-story blocks disoriented the mind. Residents would get off the bus and walk into the wrong building, go up to the wrong floor and try their key in the wrong door, simply because every single sensory cue was identical to their own. The uniformity was so aggressive it erased individual identity. Inside the apartments, the fight against the elements became a war of attrition. Remember the cold wall, the thermal bridges where the heat escaped? By the mid-80s, residents had stopped waiting for the state to fix it. They developed their own insulation technologies. If you walked into a typical apartment, you would see heavy wool carpets hanging on every wall. Western visitors thought this was a quaint Slavic decorative tradition. It wasn't. It was thermal survival. The carpet created a dead airspace between the freezing concrete and the living room. It stopped the cold radiation that residents swore they could feel emanating from the structure. But behind those carpets, in the dark, damp space against the wall, mold was blooming. The poor ventilation and the condensation created perfect incubators for black mold. Respiratory issues, asthma, and chronic coughs became the background noise of the sleeping districts. The buildings were making their inhabitants sick. And yet, and here's the paradox that breaks your heart, people fought to get into these apartments. Why? Because the alternative was worse. The communal apartments, the kommunalki, of the Stalin era, where 5 families shared one kitchen and one toilet, were a circle of hell. A cracking, leaking, freezing panel apartment in Chernobyl was still a palace compared to sharing a bathroom with 20 strangers. So the people accepted the Tufta. They accepted the lies. They accepted that the elevator would break every other day. They accepted that the hot water would be turned off for maintenance for a month every summer. But as the 1980s ground toward their conclusion, the systemic rot began to accelerate. The Brezhnev stagnation wasn't just economic, it was structural. The maintenance budgets, already meager, began to evaporate. The ZHECs ran out of even the stolen spare parts. The garbage chutes, clogged for years, were simply welded shut in some buildings to stop the smell, forcing residents to carry trash down 16 flights of stairs because the elevator was also broken. The temporary housing was entering its terminal phase, but the state was collapsing too fast to notice. In a grim irony, the state launched a new policy in the late 80s, uskorenia, acceleration. They wanted to build even faster. This led to the final generation of Soviet housing, the absolute bottom of the barrel. If the K7s of the 60s were thin and the Brezhnev towers of the 70s were leaky, the late 80s blocks were barely held together. Theft was so rampant that entire floors were poured with concrete that was essentially gray water. Reinforcement bars were skipped entirely in non-load-bearing walls, and sometimes in load-bearing ones. We have records of inspection teams in 1988 walking into completed buildings and pushing over interior walls with their bare hands. This was the unraveling, the social contract. We pretend to work and you pretend to pay us. had extended to "we pretend to build and you pretend to live." But there were people who saw the end coming.
Deep in the archives, there are warnings. Soviet seismologists and structural engineers began writing urgent memos to the Central Committee. They warned that the lean concrete was carbonating at a rate of 2 centimeters per year. They warned that the weld points on the K7 series were almost completely rusted through in some districts. They predicted a wave of cascading collapses. A cascading collapse is the engineer's worst nightmare. Because the panel buildings are like a house of cards, if one load-bearing panel fails, say on the first floor due to rust or an explosion, the panel above it falls, and the one above that. The entire vertical section of the building shears off. The engineers asked for funds to reinforce the joints. They asked for a massive renovation program. They were ignored. The Soviet Union was bankrupt. It was fighting a war in Afghanistan. It was trying to clean up Chernobyl. There was no money to fix the cracks in Moscow. So the memos were filed away. The cracks were wallpapered over. The carpets were hung back up. And then, in 1991, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union ceased to exist. Overnight, the state apparatus responsible for these 40,000 buildings vanished. The Ministry of Construction? Gone. The Central Planning Committee? Gone. The residents of the sleeping districts woke up in a new country, but they were trapped in the old concrete. And now there was nobody left to call. The ZEC had no funding. The liquid currency of vodka was replaced by hyperinflation. The concrete jungle was now an orphan. But the buildings didn't care about politics. The chemistry of the concrete kept working. The carbon dioxide kept eating the lime. The moisture kept eating the steel. The biological time bombs, the chicken bones and vodka bottles inside the walls kept rotting. The residents were now owners of their apartments. The state gave them the property rights for free. A generous gift, it seemed. But it was a poisoned chalice. They were now the owners of a decaying asset that was structurally designed to fail. They were living inside a ticking clock that had started its countdown in 1980, and the alarm was about to go off. The alarm went off on New Year's Eve, 2018. It happened in Magnitogorsk, an industrial city in the Urals, but it could have happened in Belyaevo or Chernobyl or any of the sleeping districts we've walked through. The building at 164 Karl Marx Avenue was a standard Soviet block built in 1973 using the same panel technology, the same lean concrete, and the same rushed labor as the Moscow towers. At 6:02 a.m., while the city slept, a section of the building simply ceased to exist. Officially, the cause was a gas explosion, but what terrified the engineers wasn't the explosion itself. It was how the building reacted. It didn't just endure damage, it suffered a progressive collapse. The structural redundancy was non-existent. When one panel failed, the one above it had nothing to hold on to. It fell, taking the next one and the next one. 39 people died in the rubble. This tragedy ripped the mask off the legacy of Soviet housing. It forced the authorities to admit what the residents had known since 1980. The 100-year guarantee was a myth. These buildings were not fortresses. They were houses of cards glued together with adulterated cement and falsified paperwork. The Magnitogorsk collapse was the detonator for a realization that had been building for decades. The housing stock of the Brezhnev era was not just aging, it was becoming lethal. The time bombs planted in the 1980s, the rusting rebar, the crumbling mortar, the rotting organic matter, were beginning to detonate. In Moscow, the government's response was drastic. They launched the renovation program. If you visit Moscow today, you will see entire districts being erased. The official line is urban renewal. They talk about modernization and beautification. But talk to the engineers on the ground and you hear a different story. This is not a renovation, it is an emergency intervention.
The city is frantically tearing down thousands of the K7 and early Brezhnev-era buildings because they have realized that they are structurally insolvent. The city acknowledges that these buildings, designed as temporary solutions, have become permanent liabilities. And as the excavators tear into the old walls, the truth finally spills out. Demolition crews are finding the physical evidence of the crimes we've discussed. As the giant claws of the machines rip the panels apart, they expose the twisted, rusted rebar that has thinned to the width of a wire. They find the concrete crumbling into dust because the carbonation has reached the core. And they find the trash. In the debris of the demolished K7s, workers are still finding the vodka bottles, the construction uniforms, and the petrified remains of food waste thrown into the walls by the Limitchiki 40 years ago. The biological time bombs are finally being disarmed, but only by destroying the building itself. This is the ultimate payoff of the mystery of 1980. The concrete jungle was never meant to be a permanent civilization. It was a temporary holding pen for a labor force that the state viewed as a renewable resource. The 40,000 buildings that rose to meet the Olympic year were not homes. They were storage units for labor. They were built on a foundation of systemic corruption, exploitative labor practices, and a cynical disregard for the long-term well-being of the inhabitants. The state prioritized a single metric, housing units per capita, and sacrificed everything else to achieve it. They mobilized vast resources to solve a statistical problem while utterly failing to address the human dimension. And yet, there is a final, haunting paradox. Despite the leaking walls, the freezing drafts, the lack of privacy, and the smell of rot, these buildings created a community. The shared struggle against the architecture forged a bond between the residents. Because you could hear your neighbor's life through the wall, you knew your neighbor. Because you all had to hack the system to get a plumber, you shared contacts and vodka. Because the courtyard was a wind tunnel, you huddled together. The legacy of 1980 is not the gleaming city of the Olympics. That facade has long since faded. The Finnish salami is gone. The Pepsi Cola is just a soda. The true legacy is the gray, enduring resilience of the residents who made homes in the hollow spaces of a system that didn't care if they froze. Stand in Belyaevo tonight. The wind is still howling through the gaps between the towers. The snow is falling on the flat roofs that are almost certainly leaking. The concrete is gray and stained with 50 years of exhaust and grime.
But look at the windows. There are lights on. Behind those thin, insufficient panels, people are drinking tea. They are watching TV. They are alive. They survived the system. They survived the cold. They survived the architecture. The Soviet Union collapsed. The ideology died. The leaders in their brick fortresses on Kutuzovsky Prospect are dead and buried. But for the concrete ocean remains. It is cracked, it is rusting, and it is slowly being torn down. But for now, it is still standing. And deep inside the machine, life goes on.